How about this? Suppose I'm just...
Thank you.
Okay.
So,
How about the
the
tits? You
point
want to get
is-
rid of the tits?
No, we love Barbie's bust
the
over
point
there.
is the tits so overwhelm everything that people forget. I mean, your background, which I'll start gabbing to tell us about. Humor started real early with Hugh Hefner, college, and the humor magazine. You now may speak.
You want me to reflect on my earlier connections to what? To
humor.
The humor?
Yeah, when you started earlier. I mean, the point is, you say Hugh Hefner, you think about
Pretty ladies.
pretty ladies. Yeah.
You don't think about laughs and chuckles.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there is a strong connection between the beginnings of Playboy and what was going on in comedy in the 1950s. Most of the fellows in this, all of the fellows who are in this picture, who are doing this cross-country tour, are longtime personal friends of mine. And that has to do with, I think, the fact that Playboy began at the end of 1953. It was a very conservative era, politically, socially, sexually. And the changes that took place, the dramatic changes that took place, that began in the 1950s, but took place most obviously in the 60s, what we think about as the sexual revolution, didn't really happen in the political arena. They happened by and large in the nightclubs, on the nightclub stages, and the pages of Playboy. And a lot of that also happened to be coincidentally connected to Chicago. In other words, I was born and raised in Chicago. And coincidentally, at the very time that I was starting the magazine, a lot of other things were happening in Chicago too. Second City began there, and it began as something called the Compass Players out on the south side of Chicago, where I actually started the magazine at the University of University of Chicago. I didn't start the magazine there, but the Compass Players were connected to the University of Chicago. And Mike Nichols and Elaine May were part of that group, and so was Shelley Berman. And one of their early, in the latter 1950s, one of their extemporaneous pieces of material was related to Playboy, and Playboy was causing a big stir by the middle 50s. And I went out to the South Side and saw the show and met the guys. Compass Players then morphed into Second City. And when I did Playboy's Penthouse, a television show that I started hosting in the fall of 1959, we used a lot of comedy acts and musical acts that were working in Chicago. Now, in that same time frame, or shortly before that, we ran the first national stories about Lenny Bruce and Mort Saul, and gave them their first national exposure. And both became close personal friends, and both hung out at the Playboy Mansion and actually stayed at the Playboy Mansion at various times when they were living in Chicago. Mort actually hosted our first, or emceed our first Playboy Jazz Festival. We celebrated the 5th anniversary of the magazine in the summer of 1959 in Chicago at the Chicago Stadium, and put together what Leonard Feather called the greatest weekend in the history of jazz, because it had almost all the jazz greats, and I got Mort to host the show. And right after doing that show, then I started hosting this syndicated television show called Playboy's Penthouse, and most of the club guys that had become friends, Don Adams and a number of the other guys, appeared on that show, including members of Second City. And with Lenny, when Lenny got into trouble and was arrested across the country in various clubs, including the Gate of Horn in Chicago, Shel Silverstein, who was a close friend and cartoonist and songwriter for Playboy, was there when he was busted at the Gate of Horn. A little known fact, that was December of 1962. I had just started writing the Playboy Philosophy, an editorial series about the social sexual changes that I thought should be taking place in America. And when they busted Lenny, I saw the connection between what was going on with Playboy and what was going on with the Catholic Church involvement in politics in Chicago and beyond. In other words, I grew up much influenced by the movies. I was born in 1926 and was old enough to recognize when the production code came in, censorship came in a big way in the middle of 1934. And that was connected to the Catholic Legion of Decency and the production code, which is also run by Catholics, and a lot of it came out of Chicago. So I was very much aware of all of that. So I wrote an editorial in my editorial series, the Playboy Philosophy. I wrote in the spring of '63, pointing out, as a matter of fact, as had Variety at the time of Lenny's arrest, the fact that what they really objected to was not really the dirty words. What they really objected to was what he had to say about some of the things going on in terms of organized religion and race. So when I commented about that and commented about the connection between that and the church in the editorial series in the spring of '63, in May of 1963, the cops came knocking on my door and they arrested me. And the alleged reason for the arrest was a Jane Mansfield pictorial. But I always felt that the real reason was because we had attacked the city's fathers and the connection to the archdiocese related to Lenny. And I followed that then by, we published Lenny's autobiography in book form and then in the magazine, How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. And the connection for me with humor, there was a very good book, the title of which I may not remember, about those days, and it was written by the guy who edited the National Lampoon. And it was all about humor, and particularly related in those years, and he comments about the connections between the fact that one way or the other we always seemed to be there in that time frame related to those guys. And a lot of it had to do, of course, with the fact that that with the Playboy clubs, when the Playboy clubs the first Playboy club began in February of 1960, and when they by the middle of the 1960s, we had about 20 clubs across the country, and it became a form of the last stages of vaudeville. In other words, what we had was the Playboy club circuit, so you could work for the club all year long. And we had young acts, music, jazz, comedy, vocalists, and we'd put 3 or 4 acts in a single show, and they'd work for 3 weeks, and then go on to another club, and you know, it would go on and on and on. In the process, most of that had to do with the fact that although I had a day job, I worked more at night, and as soon as I got through with my editorial stuff, I would go out on the scene and spend my nights at the clubs. So most of my friends were not really day people, and most of my friends were not really Writers. Most of my friends were really show people. They were people in the clubs. Don Adams and Bill and the rest of the guys were, and Mort and Lenny, etc., were close personal friends, and that then led very naturally into my involvement with all of them. With Lenny, as a matter of fact, I was responsible indirectly for Lenny actually getting his exposure east of California. He was popular on the West Coast, and he was working at a club in San Francisco called Ann's 440. And I went to see him along with two close friends of mine, one of whom will be playing cards with me tonight, Skip Krask and Shelley Caston, and voices out of the past. They are still friends. And on Wednesday nights I play cards with old friends, including my brother, and including, when he is well enough, Don Adams. Don may be here tonight. It depends. He was not here this last weekend, but he's here usually on weekends and on Wednesdays for card nights when he's feeling well enough. We went and saw Lenny at Ann's 440. His mother, Sally Marr, was at the door, taking the money at the door, and the act blew us away. And Shelley and Skippy were running a club called the Cloister at the Maryland Hotel on Rush Street, and we're going to start booking nightclub acts. Before that, it had been mostly just a bar and lounge, and Lenny was the first act.
As I remember, the Cloisters, but this was 57, 56 or 57, with the was the gin. What was the game you guys?
Gin Rummy, which is what we're going to play tonight.
And
some things never change.
I was the guy that had the gig. I was writing the Steve Allen show, and then I came in to Don Adams calls, hey, you got to come into Chicago, man. This stuff is happening here. I said, you mean it's the toddling town? Mm-hmm. Anyway, went in there, and all the toddling was done sitting, watching you and Skip, Trask, and wait a minute, Shelley, give me the, what do you want from me? I'm 80 years old. No.
That's all right. I'm almost there.
No, you just made Shelley Caston and
Skip Trask.
And Skip Trask.
Yeah. Well, the joke was that when the club was not doing very well, they made it up in the back room with the gin rummy. In other words, there'd be nobody in the room, but they would still make out because they were better gin players than Don and I were.
And that was, you were just building. You were telling us about this place you were going to build, the Playboy Mansion.
Uh-huh.
I remember and you said over here,
yes,
we're going to have a wall and a
swimming pool,
and I'm saying,
yeah. I know. I remember. Yes, I had these plans for the. Originally, I was going to, because I worked round the clock at the office and lived at the office. Had a bedroom in the office at 232 East Ohio, the Playboy building, and then I started thinking about getting a place so that I would get away from the office occasionally. Originally, I was going to build a townhouse. I actually bought a piece of property on the near north side, and then the cost was too excessive. And then I discovered this incredible mansion on State Street, State Parkway, in the same block as the Ambassador West Hotel. And I acquired that and put a swimming pool in it, and the underwater bar, and and I think that when I was first talking about it, none of the guys really figured it was ever going to happen.
Yeah. As a point supporting the fact that you were so supportive Dick, if you could reflect on putting Dick Gregory on not as a Negro, the expression of the day, but just as another a funny guy, which was a major breakthrough.
Well, when we started, it was my love of entertainment comes out of jazz and comedy, and the only place where you would see black performers working in a white club were by and large music connected, particularly with jazz. We used to go out to the South Side, what they call the black and tan clubs, where the audience was actually black and white. In the 1950s and early 60s, Chicago, like much of America, was very segregated. One thinks of segregation as being a Southern phenomenon, but the reality is Chicago was a very segregated city in the 1950s, and black acts did not work in white clubs. We saw Gregory working, and I can't remember the name of the club, but we saw him in a black club on the South Side, and I'd already gone through the racial thing with Playboy's Penthouse. We began shooting, as I said. We started shooting Playboy's Penthouse in the fall of 1959. It was a syndicated show, so I didn't have to answer to anybody. I didn't have to deal with any sponsors or any networks. And the theme of the show was the notion that I was throwing a party in my apartment, in my penthouse apartment. And the acts and the guests, therefore, in that social setting were both black and white. And that automatically meant that we would have no distribution in the South. And we had no distribution in the South. When we started the Playboy clubs, the clubs were open for members. It was a private club membership, but race was not a consideration. And when we saw, and we'd already booked. We had a black trio, I think, working in the living room, etc. But when we hired Dick Gregory, it was the first time that a black comic, stand-up comic, had actually worked in a predominantly white nightclub, and it caused a sensation. And Dick speaks eloquently about it, and it was and have a very special relationship with Dick Gregory. We then, the next two clubs after Chicago, because we started then opening clubs across the country, some of them wholly owned, some of them franchised. The next two clubs were franchises, and they were opened in Miami and New Orleans. Well, we immediately had problems there in terms of membership, because in Georgia they actually had laws against black and white and clubs, etc. And when it turned into a conflict with our franchise owners, we actually bought the franchises back so that we could run them without any color line, and actually sent Dick down, and he appeared in the Southern clubs as well, and was hugely popular. And it was, part of the message that is clear in all of this is that the social and sexual and racial changes that took place in the 50s and 60s took place in most unusual places, and some of them were in nightclubs.
There's something that I remember very vividly, and I don't remember the names, but it's one of, I didn't really need any more reasons to admire you and what you were doing, but there was a DJ in some southern town who was in prison because a young lady came in and did a Monica Lewinsky for him, and he ended up.
Yes, I remember the case very well.
tell us about that. I don't remember the details.
Well, when I started writing the Playboy Philosophy in the fall of in December of 1963, started writing about social changes and about the repressing sex laws and censorship and etc. And I was in service during World War II. I graduated from high school in Chicago in January of '44 and went into the Army in the spring of '44 and spent 2 years there. And then came out and went to the University of Illinois. And after that, did one semester of postgraduate work at Northwestern, where my brother was an undergraduate. While I was at the University of Illinois in 1948, the first Kinsey report came out about sexual behavior in the human male, and I commented on that being the most important book of the year. And I was editing a magazine, a humor magazine called Shaft at the time, introduced a feature in it called the Coed of the Month. She had her clothes on, but it was the same concept. At Northwestern, I did a postgraduate paper comparing Kinsey statistics and the laws of the land of the then 48 states, and made the point that if the laws were successfully enforced, most of us would be in prison. Because in those days, all sexual activity that was not for procreation in marriage was illegal in most states. Adultery, fornication, the sodomy laws, which are the most heinous of all, what they call the abominable and detestable crimes against nature, covered the blanket of all non-coital activity. In other words, oral sex, anal sex, even in 2 states, Indiana and one of the western states, mutual masturbation was considered sodomy. And they were all based on the notion that there was immoral if it didn't lead to procreation. So I was making a case for more rational sex laws. I've wandered away here. Where were we?
No, we were. You didn't. You answered the,
well, it's all
the
related.
question. I'm just wondering whether that guy.
Oh yes, the guy. Okay, right. Well, when I started doing the Playboy Philosophy, it was on the same kind of subject. This was a subject very close to me from very early on, and I've thought a great deal about that and why it is so important. And as a matter of fact, all of that has to do with obviously the creation of Playboy. I think it's because I was raised in a truly typical Midwestern Methodist home with a lot of repression, with very little hugging and kissing. And I think that I, at a very early age, related repression and the lack of affection in my home to censorship, to repression in society at large, to the production code, to the fact that in the movies that I loved, where the dreams and fantasies came alive, from 1934 on, even married people couldn't sleep in the same bed. They had to have twin beds, and there were no toilets in the bathrooms, and Betty Boop lost her garter, and they put more clothes on Tarzan and Jane in the Weissmuller Tarzan movies. And all of this affected me very much as a kid. So I'm doing this series about sexual repression, and I introduced a feature called the Playboy Forum that gave the readers an opportunity to respond to these various kinds of things. And in 1965, I established the Playboy Foundation. The Playboy Foundation was, in effect, to put my money where my mouth was in terms of censorship and repression and these sex laws. And along the way, we got this letter from a mother whose son was a disc jockey in West Virginia, who was serving something like 10 years, 10-year sentence, for having, what did you call it? Oral sex.
Yeah.
We wrote about it in the magazine. We got a lawyer for him, etc., and we got him out.
Well, we did get.
We got him out.
Didn't know the second shoe had dropped. In the environment of repressive, what you just described, did you get a chance to use your humor for survival?
Well, I think so. One of the early cartoonists that started working for us was Jules Pfeiffer, and he was doing in the pages of Playboy and in the Village Voice what Second City and Mike and Elaine and Mort and Lenny and others were doing on the nightclub stage. And there's a wonderful quote from him, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, in those days we didn't have to worry about who the enemy was, because whether it was our parents or the teachers or the police or the government, they were all lying to us. So humor in those days was based upon that perception, that indeed we lived in a world of hypocrisy and lies. And I think that a part of what Playboy was all about. I never thought about the magazine as a rebel publication, but the reality was it was a lifestyle magazine, and because it took an attitude that was very had made fun of Puritanism, sexual and other, and because we featured stories, articles, and profiles, and later on interviews with people like Mort and Lenny and the other comics who were working in those early days, we were a little band of rebels, and we were true believers. I think one of the reasons, because I started the magazine with absolutely no money at all. I borrowed $600 in order to start the magazine. I hocked my furniture. I put my furniture up as collateral for that loan, and managed to raise just $8,000 in all. And from that, I started the magazine. If it had not been successful immediately, we would not be here today. But it pushed a button in a great many young people, particularly on college campuses and in the major cities. And spoke with a different point of view, and a lot of it had to do with the satire and comedy. I think that comedy was one of the ways in which you escaped from that conformity. It's very interesting that, as a matter of fact, I think that it is not a coincidence that rock and roll started at the same time. Rock and roll started in the middle 1950s, and I think that a lot of the social changes that took place came out of the comedy and the music of the times. And there's also a very real connection between the kind of improvisational thing that Mort and Lenny were doing, very much connected to the jazz clubs that they worked in. And they very correctly saw similarities in terms of the kind of improvisational kind of music that was being played. And of course, jazz itself, and then later on rock and roll, also were forms of more than entertainment. There was a protest element within them.
The commonality when we've been talking to other people in humor, about humor as a survival mechanism, and also the healing power of laughter, play, positive attitude.
I remember, as a matter of fact, when Jules Pfeiffer came to visit, he was working regularly for Playboy, located in New York. He came to visit Chicago, and I took him to see Lenny for the first time. He'd never seen Lenny, and he was not amused to begin with. He was initially offended, and then it changed. I also took him to see his first Second City, and later on he started working with Second City, and some of the live things, the plays that he did, were performed by Second City people. One of my editors, Eugene Trubnik, worked for the magazine during the day and worked at Second City at night.
We chatted with Shelley Berman. I'm trying to think of the last. You should have been there with Shelley. Did this whole confessional about what I was calling why Shelley Berman has to do a one-man show, and we were reflecting back on that group with that became the Compass Players that became
Second City.
a second city, and the excitement that was generated in Chicago that's usually attributed to either the left or the right coast. The by the way, Jenny, anytime you want
You're
to
doing
jump
so
in,
well.
I asked Hef if it was okay.
Yep. Well, it would be great if you could expand a bit more on comedy as a tool to get the kind of messages that you were trying to tackle with Playboy magazine and Playboy as a forum, which was, in your Playboy philosophy, you address different social and sexual mores. How comedy perhaps is a more palatable way to get some of these questions across.
Well, comedy's always been a major part of the magazine. In other words, the full-page cartoons. It's almost impossible. They talk about. I once said at the 25th anniversary to a gathering, a Playmate reunion, I said, without you girls, I would have been publishing a literary magazine. Well, the same is also true for the cartoons. In other words, the centerfolds and the cartoons are really the heart of the magazine. And you can say things in humor, whether it's in an article or stand-up comedy or a cartoon that deflates hypocrisy and speaks to lifestyle. I think that what set Playboy apart from very early on in terms of lifestyle, people think about, because of the Playmate, they think of it as a sex magazine. I have never thought of it as a sex magazine. I think it is essentially a lifestyle magazine with sex. The romantic connection between the sexes from the male point of view is really what Playboy is really all about. And when I started the magazine, after World War II, all the men's magazines were outdoor adventure books. And I think it had to do with a kind of connection between the guys, kind of a buddy relationship that was established during the war. And there was a lot of pressure, both governmental and other, to get the women out of the workforce, because the women during the war, had been in men's jobs, had been in the factories, had been in the offices, etc., and while the men were away fighting the war. And it was expected that they would go back into the home. The guys would come back, they get married, they move in the suburbs, they start having 2.1 children and live happily ever after in Levittown. It didn't work for everybody. And I think that what I tried to create with Playboy, in contrast to True Magazine, Argosy, Mail, Stag, the magazines that were so very popular after the war, instead of simply suggesting that, because in the men's magazines, in those outdoor adventure magazines, the guys would hang out with the guys, the women would stay at home, take care of the kids, they would go out and play poker or go hunting or fishing or whatever, etc. And those are not the things that interested me. I was interested in the romantic connection between the sexes. And I think that was the whole premise of Playboy. And, satirizing it and having fun with it, of course, was part of it, too.
It'd be interesting to get your observations. When Don and I and Shelley and Morton, all of us were starting in terms of television, I've used the example that the country was so uptight sexually you couldn't show a close-up of the stork on Zoo Parade on TV. So that you really had to be funny. I mean, you had to get your laughs above the belt. Today, 3 dots. Give me your comments on what's going on today.
Well, I think that what's going on today is a curious conflict that is in various forms been going on since the very beginning. I mean, remember, the Puritans left England to get away from religious persecution, and when they got over here, they turned around and started persecuting the people who didn't agree with them. And so that's as American as apple pie, that conflict. I mean, the founding fathers gave us a constitution to separate church and state, but that conflict is ongoing. You know, they had their scarlet letter, they had the stocks, they had these ways of humiliating people who got out of line, and some of the getting out of line had to do with sexuality. Today, we live in a very different world, and yet, on the one hand, you have explicit imagery of sexuality and all of the kinds of things on the internet and pay television, etc., and yet you can get a major scandal going over Janet Jackson's tit.
That's right. Righty, as we call her.
We don't have any kind of problems with, you know, violence in America, but sexuality continues to be a you know, a subject of scandal, and I think that Americans typically, traditionally, are, you know, fascinated with things sexual, and then they get caught up in with the notions of shame and guilt related to it, and I think that is as American as apple pie. I am an 11th generation descendant of William Bradford, who came over on the Mayflower, was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colonies, and my Puritan roots run deep, and I see the hypocrisy and the hurt in it.
That's fascinating. Being from Quincy, Massachusetts, not too far from Salem.
There you go. And what happened there?
But as we speak, you can hear the burning of the bitches and the witches. Oh, boy. I'm not talking about you, Jenny, in any terms.
I wouldn't mind if you were.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that as a comedy writer in those days, with those rules,
Mm-hmm.
program practices, which was the euphemism for censorship, one would think that with the license they have today, that things would be some degree funnier.
Well, yeah.
I'm wondering if you agree with me that it really ain't.
No, but of course there are two different things going on. You know, part of it has to do with talent. You know, some of the best in movies, for example, some of the best, most sophisticated films were made during the 1930s and early 1940s, when censorship was in full force. Does that make a case for censorship? No, it doesn't. But you know, it has to do with, among other things, the fact that in the 1930s it was a depression, and most of the talented writers and actors and directors, etc., was all in Hollywood. So you got better movies because there were better people working on them. What is unique about today is that the technology has given us a kind of freedom that we didn't have before. In other words, the existence of the internet and pay television, etc., that gets around some of the limitations. And yet at the same time, you still get the scandals and the controversy, not only related to a singer's breast on a Super Bowl, but you also get you know, the federal FAA getting, or not, the FCC getting very tough on language, etc., in television, and the whole controversy related to the shock jock whose name escapes me at the moment. Howard Stern. Yeah. In other words, so you get that conflict, and what I'm really saying is that I think we are much freer today. That doesn't necessarily make us funnier, but even though we are freer, the controversy is still there. There's still, in other words, the government at the present time is a conservative government, so once again, we are dealing with the implications of repression.
Other than the ballot box, anything to do about it?
Well, because we live in a democracy, and because a majority of the people have values that, as I say, are rather schizophrenic. I think that we have very, not only hypocritical, very schizophrenic attitudes on sex and religion, and so we're doing pretty well considering. I quite frankly, I don't think that's our major problem. Our major problem is the fact that we have reached a point where scientifically and technologically we're able to destroy ourselves, destroy the planet. And we have not learned yet how to live with one another. We are separated by ethnic and religious and national boundaries. And that's the great sadness, because if we are still in many ways superstitious savages in the jungle. We now have the capacity technologically and scientifically to destroy one another. And that ain't funny. Although we do humor about even that. I just okayed a Gay and Wilson cartoon in which an elderly couple or a middle-aged couple are looking out the window and the atomic bomb is going off, and they said, well, now we don't have to worry about our retirement problems anymore.
The magazine seems to it made it possible to talk about a subject that was taboo, being sex, and also to laugh about it. And it seems that you've, through the magazine, through the Playboy clubs, have used humor as to kind of spotlight these issues and to magnify some of these issues. And I'm wondering if you once said that Playboy served to help us find our own identities. Do you think laughter can do that?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it, absolutely. I mean, I remember a conversation I had with my mother. My mother did an interview once in which the interviewer asked her whether that she thought sex was funny, and she said she didn't think sex was funny. And I said, how can you say that? And of course, if you don't see the humor in something, you don't see the humanity in it. And that is one of the great problems that we have with our sexual taboos, etc. It becomes almost a religious experience, and the repression comes out of that, and it's associated with sin rather than with joy. What we're talking about here in terms of sexuality is the life force. It is the major civilizing influence on the planet. The major civilizing force on this planet is not religion, it is sexuality. It is the attraction between the sexes, which establishes the beginning of tribe and family and civilization itself.
When will you next be invited to the White House?
I haven't spent too much time there. Not even in the Clinton days.
Having the type of celebrity that you have had, I mean, the dosage you've had is out of sight. Mixed metaphor. And from my point of view, because I've seen you throughout these stages, there's been almost an abnormal amount of grace about it. Where does that come from?
I'm just a sweet pussycat.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Well,
talk a little bit about fame.
Well, I think that the old adage is power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. One of the things that has always been very important to me is, with the coming of wealth and celebrity, etc., to not have it rob me of my humanity. Because if you do, you are the loser for it. One of the things when people ask me about it, because there's great curiosity about my life because of the public nature of it, and the ladies and etc. And I say with great candor, I said, my life is an open book with illustrations. Is it any different than what people perceive it to be? Yes, it's actually better, and it is. because you know, there's the old tradition, if you have all the good luck and you know, you're somehow going to have to pay the fiddler. If you dance a merry tune, you're going to have to pay the fiddler. And that, of course, comes from our Puritan perceptions. But I think my life is better than it appears from outside because I am happier and because people don't really know the extent to which I have a family of friends that I have shared all of this with and continually stayed in touch with my own childhood, stayed in touch with the boy who dreamed the impossible dreams, who was influenced so by the movies and the music of my childhood and all those dreams and fantasies. And I wake up every day with a real appreciation of not only my good fortune, I mean, you know, from my perspective, I'm the luckiest cat on the planet, and I know it, and I am grateful for it. And not having it influence me in a negative way is very, very important to me. Because otherwise, you know, what do you get as a result? I mean, you know, then you have it all and you have nothing.
I want to be with you next Thanksgiving. Share that sense. Well, you've been eloquent and generous with your time. Jenny, what have I left out?
He seems to have touched on every subject that we had, but I just wonder if you think, in the light of everything going on in the world today, do you think we need to laugh more?
Always. Without question. As I said, I think that humor is the heart of humanity. And, you know, that's one of the things that sets us apart from the lower species, I think, the sense of humor, and it helps to give you perspective. I think humor, properly understood, is a very serious business.
It's
Okay.
A very cogent punctuation. Thanks, Hef.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Give it to Hefner a hand. Oh.